A boy finds a baby in the trash and immediately takes it to the hospital. The doctor is horrified when he realizes that the cold October wind cut through the narrow streets of Ashbury, a small town in the north of England, with a biting sharpness that made Ethan James bury his face deeper into the collar of his coat. His backpack jostled with every hurried step as he walked down the familiar route toward school, his breath visible in the chilly morning air. The shortcut through the alley saved him a good 10 minutes on his journey, something he appreciated more now that the weather was getting colder. It was the kind of day where everyone wanted to stay inside. Ethan had taken this route dozens of times without incident. The alley was mostly deserted except for a few scattered trash bins and piles of leaves that had gathered in corners. He had never found it threatening. It was just a quick pass between two streets, a quiet little detour in an otherwise routine morning. Today, though, something felt different. As he approached the middle of the alley, the familiar sounds of the town, distant traffic, the occasional chatter of early morning commuters, faded, leaving an unsettling quiet in their place. It wasn't the silence itself that disturbed him, but something he couldn't quite name. A feeling, the kind that creeps up on you when something isn't right. Then he heard it, a sound so faint it barely registered at first. He stopped in his tracks and straining to listen. Was it the wind? No, it was something else. A weak, stuttering cry, like a small, desperate voice lost in the noise of the world. He looked around, confused, scanning the alley for the source. The cry came again, this time clearer. It was unmistakable now. A baby. Ethan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound sent a chill through his body, colder than the October air. He wasn't imagining it. Someone had left a baby out here, in the trash, in the cold. For a brief moment, his legs locked in place. His mind raced, trying to process what he was hearing, what he was supposed to do. His body told him to move on, but something else, a deep, gnawing fear, kept him rooted to the spot. He wasn't the type to get involved. His dad had always told him to keep his head down, mind his business, and stay out of trouble. The world was a complicated place, full of problems bigger than a 12-year-old could handle. And this was one of those problems. A newborn baby, abandoned and alone in a filthy alley. That wasn't something he knew how to deal with. His first instinct was to turn around, to pretend he hadn't heard anything, and walk away. Someone else would find the baby. Someone more equipped to handle this. Someone older, wiser, more responsible. Maybe a passerby. Maybe someone living nearby who heard the same cries he did. It wasn't his responsibility. What could he do anyway? But as soon as the thought entered his mind, guilt followed. What if no one else heard the cries? What if no one else was around? The baby's soft, desperate sounds seemed to grow louder in his mind, filling the alley. What if it was dying, right there in front of him, and he just walked away? He glanced back toward the end of the alley, where the street opened up to the main road. If he kept walking, no one would know. He could go on with his day, get to school, and never think about it again. But then the image of that helpless baby flashed in his mind. Tiny, fragile, alone. If he didn't act, who would? Ethan's heart pounded harder as he realized he was at a crossroads. He could either ignore it and hope someone else would come, or he could push past his fear and do something. What if it was too late by the time someone else found the baby? He felt his stomach twist. He had to at least look. His legs trembled as he took a hesitant step toward the sound. Then another, inching closer to the pile of trash where the faint cries seemed to come from. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to leave this nightmare behind. But his feet kept moving. The smell of rotting garbage hit him as he neared the trash bags piled against the alley wall. It was overwhelming, thick and putrid, and it made him want to gag. He paused, taking a deep breath to steady himself. His hands shook as he reached out to shift one of the bags aside, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. And then beneath the tattered remains of an old blanket, he saw it. A baby, a newborn, tiny and pale, swaddled in a filthy, torn piece of cloth. Its skin was so light it was almost blue, and its eyes were half closed, too weak to even cry properly. The little whimpers that had stopped Ethan in his tracks had faded into nothing more than shallow breaths. The baby wasn't moving much, its body limp and cold. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His entire body went numb as he stared down at the infant. For a few moments, everything else disappeared, the alley, the noise, even the cold air. There was just him and this fragile, abandoned life lying there in the trash. His mind blanked, overwhelmed by the horror of what he was seeing. This can't be real, he thought. Who would leave a baby here? His hands hovered above the baby, unsure of what to do. Should he pick it up? Should he call for help? His fingers shook as he crouched closer, the reality of the situation crashing down on him. This baby was going to die if he didn't do something. Right here, right now. But fear gripped him. What if he hurt the baby by moving it? What if it was already too late? 1,000 panicked thoughts raced through his head, each one more terrifying than the last. He wasn't equipped for this. He wasn't a doctor. He didn't know how to handle a newborn. But leaving it there, cold and alone in a pile of trash, felt even worse. If I don't act now, no one will, he thought again. This time with a sense of finality that settled deep in his chest. His movements became automatic, driven by an instinct he didn't fully understand. Carefully, he reached down and lifted the baby from the ground. The infant barely stirred, its tiny body almost weightless in his arms. It was cold, so cold it made Ethan's skin crawl with fear. He wrapped the blanket tighter around the baby, hoping to shield it from the biting wind. Ethan stood, the baby cradled against his chest, and started walking, slowly at first, then faster as adrenaline took over. The hospital was only a few blocks away, and he knew he had to get there fast. His legs felt like lead-eye, but his heart raced with urgency. He didn't know if the baby would make it, but he had to try. As he ran down the street, his mind whirled with questions he couldn't answer. What would the doctors say when he showed up with a baby he found in the trash? Would they think he was lying? Would they even be able to save it? But none of that mattered right now. The only thing that mattered was getting the baby to safety. The automatic doors of Ashbury General Hospital whooshed open as Ethan burst inside, the cold morning air clinging to his clothes as he stumbled into the warmth. His chest burned from the cold air he had inhaled during his frantic run, and his legs felt like jelly. Still, he clutched the tiny, limp form in his arms, feeling its frail weight and the soft, shallow breaths against his chest. A whirlwind of panic, fear, and something else, something urgent and raw, surged inside him. For a split second, the sight of the hospital lobby was overwhelming. It was brighter than he expected, the white fluorescent lights reflecting off shiny floors and sterile walls. People moved around him, patients, nurses, hospital staff, but none of them seemed to notice him at first. Not until he shouted, "Help, please." His voice cracked, catching the attention of a nurse at the reception desk. "It's a baby. I found a baby." The nurse's head snapped up, her expression shifting from casual distraction to alarm. Her wide eyes locked onto the bundle in Ethan's arm, and she was out of her chair in an instant, moving quickly toward him. The seconds that passed felt endless, and Ethan's grip on the baby tightened instinctively as the nurse reached him. Her hand hovered over the baby, her face filled with a mix of concern and disbelief. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she took in the sight of the newborn, wrapped in the filthy, torn blanket. "What happened? Where did you find it?" Ethan's throat was dry, his mouth moving but no words coming out. All he could do was gesture helplessly toward the door, the image of the alley still fresh in his mind. He wanted to explain, to tell her everything, but the sight of the baby lying there in the trash, so fragile and cold, had scrambled his thoughts. "Come with me," the nurse said urgently, snapping into action. She signaled to another nurse at the far end of the room, who rushed over with a gurney. "We need to get this baby to the ER right away." In a blur, the second nurse appeared, her face stern with focus. The gurney was wheeled closer, and before Ethan knew it, the baby was lifted from his arms. For a brief moment, he hesitated, his hand still reaching out for the small form as it was placed on the gurney. The nurses worked with practiced precision, already checking the baby's pulse and breathing, shouting medical terms Ethan didn't understand. It was like watching a scene from a movie unfold before him, unreal and terrifying. He couldn't move, rooted to the spot as the nurses rushed the baby down a hallway and through a set of swinging doors, disappearing from view. The small cries that had pierced the quiet of the alley had faded into eerie silence, leaving Ethan standing there, his heart pounding so loudly in his chest that it echoed in his ears. Someone touched his arm, pulling him from the daze. It was the first nurse, her voice softer now, though still urgent. "Are you okay?" she asked, her eyes scanning his face. "Are you hurt?" Ethan shook his head, the words finally forming. "No, I found the baby in an alley, behind the shops." The nurse's eyes widened and her face paled slightly. She knelt down to his level, her voice careful and calm. "You found the baby just now?" How long has it been out there? I don't know, Ethan replied, his voice trembling. It was just there, lying in the trash. I heard it crying and... He swallowed hard, trying to push back the knot that was rising in his throat. I didn't know what to do. You did the right thing by bringing the baby here, she said, squeezing his arm gently. That was very brave. We'll take care of everything now, all right? Brave. That word echoed in his mind, though it felt hollow. Was it brave, what he had done? Or was it just what anyone would have done? The thought of leaving the baby there, of turning away and pretending he hadn't heard anything, had crossed his mind for just a split second back in that alley. And that thought made him feel ashamed now, even if he had pushed it aside and acted. But he had acted. He was here. And now it was out of his hands. The nurse guided him to a nearby bench, sitting him down carefully as if he were the one who needed medical attention. I'll get you some water, okay? Just sit tight. You've had a big shock. Ethan nodded, though his body felt numb, his mind still racing through the events of the last half hour. It had all happened so fast, but now, in the sterile calm of the hospital, the weight of it hit him. His hands were trembling slightly, the adrenaline wearing off and leaving him shaky and cold. He could still feel the baby's frail weight in his arms, the tiny body so still and cold that it made his chest tighten with fear. Is the baby going to be okay? The question lingered in his mind, heavy and unanswerable. The nurse returned with a small plastic cup of water, pressing it into his hand with a reassuring smile. Here, drink this. You're going to be all right. Ethan took a sip, though the water did little to soothe the dryness in his throat. He glanced toward the swinging doors where the baby had disappeared, his heart still thudding painfully in his chest. What's going to happen to the baby? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. The nurse sighed softly, her expression shifting to something more somber. The doctors are working on stabilizing the baby now. It was in a bad state when you brought it in, but you got here just in time. That might have saved its life. Ethan stared at her, the enormity of what she was saying sinking in. He had saved a life. That thought alone felt surreal, like something that happened in movies or stories, not in real life, not to him. But it didn't feel like a victory. The image of the baby's pale, weak body kept flashing in his mind, and all he could think about was how fragile it had been. How close to death. Just in time, he repeated, the words hollow on his lips. The nurse gave him a sympathetic look, patting his shoulder lightly. The doctors will do everything they can, okay? You've done more than enough. The baby's safe now. But Ethan wasn't sure that was true. The baby might be in the hands of doctors, but safe felt like a word that didn't belong here. Not when the baby had been abandoned in the trash, left to die. And what would happen next? What if the baby didn't make it? What if? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. A man in a white coat, his hair graying at the temples and his face etched with lines of exhaustion, stopped in front of him. His hospital ID badge read, Dr. Harper, and he gave Ethan a small, tired smile. Hi there, Dr. Harper said, his voice calm but firm. I'm Dr. Harper. You're the one who brought the baby in, right? Ethan nodded, gripping the cup of water tightly in his hands. First off, I want to tell you that what you did was incredible, Dr. Harper continued, kneeling down slightly to meet Ethan's gaze. You acted quickly, and that might have saved the baby's life. You should be very proud of yourself. Proud. Another word that felt out of place, heavy with responsibility. Ethan didn't feel proud. He felt scared, worried, unsure of what was going to happen next. But he nodded again, his throat too tight to speak. The baby's in critical condition right now, Dr. Harper went on, his tone more serious. It was severely malnourished and dehydrated when you brought it in. We're doing everything we can to stabilize it, but it's going to take some time. Right now, we're monitoring its breathing and giving it fluids. Ethan's heart sank. He had hoped for a clearer answer, something more certain. Is it going to be okay? Dr. Harper sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. We're hopeful, but it's too early to say for sure. The baby's condition is very fragile, and it was exposed to the cold for a long time. We're doing everything we can, but right now we just have to wait and see. The pit in Ethan's stomach deepened. Wait and see. It sounded like a long, endless stretch of uncertainty, the kind that gnawed at you from the inside. What happens now? Ethan asked, his voice small, almost afraid of the answer. Well, Dr. Harper said, standing up and folding his arms across his chest. "After we stabilize the baby, we'll have to notify the authorities. There'll be an investigation. We need to find out who left the baby there and why. It's important that we get to the bottom of this so that the baby can be placed in a safe environment." "The authorities," Ethan repeated, feeling a jolt of unease. Dr. Harper nodded. "Yes, the police will need to be involved. In cases like this, when a baby is abandoned, it's considered a criminal matter. But more than that, we need to understand what led to this. Sometimes people abandon children out of desperation, or because they feel they have no other choice. It's tragic, but it happens." Ethan looked down at his hands, his mind whirling with thoughts he couldn't untangle. The idea of police getting involved made everything feel heavier, more real. He had found the baby, but now it would become a case, an investigation. People would be asking questions that might not have easy answers. "What happens to the baby after?" he asked quietly. If it gets better." Dr. Harper hesitated for a moment, his eyes softening. "If the baby pulls through, it will likely be placed into the care of social services. From there, they'll assess the situation and determine whether the baby can be placed with a family or if it will need to go into foster care. But that's a long process. Right now, we're just focused on making sure the baby survives." Ethan swallowed hard, the knot in his throat tightening. The thought of the baby being passed from one system to another, without a family, without anyone to care for it, made his chest ache. It wasn't fair. No baby should have to go through that, especially not one that had already been abandoned once. He wanted to ask more, but the words stuck in his throat. What about the baby's mother? What would happen to her, and why had she left her child like that? Ethan couldn't shake the image of the baby in the trash, discarded like it didn't matter. But the more he thought about it, the more he wondered if there was more to the story. If the mother had been scared, or desperate, or alone. "We'll let you know if there are any updates, Wang," Dr. Harper said, giving him another reassuring smile before turning to leave. "For now, try to rest. You've done a lot today." As the doctor walked away, Ethan felt the weight of the situation settle more heavily on his shoulders. He had done everything he could, but somehow, it didn't feel like enough. The baby was still fighting for its life, and there were so many unknowns, so many things that could still go wrong. He leaned back in the chair, his head resting against the wall as he stared up at the ceiling. His mind was buzzing with too many thoughts to sort through, each one more confusing than the last. All he knew was that he couldn't just walk away now. He couldn't just forget what had happened, couldn't go back to his normal life and pretend that this morning hadn't changed everything. The baby's fate wasn't in his hands anymore, but that didn't stop him from caring. It didn't stop the feeling deep inside him that he had to see this through, whatever that meant. Even if it meant waiting in this hospital for hours, days, however long it took. He wasn't ready to let go, not yet. The fluorescent lights of Ashbury General Hospital flickered slightly as Ethan sat in the small waiting room, his legs bouncing nervously. The thin plastic chair felt too small, too stiff beneath him, but he hadn't moved since Dr. Harper had given him the initial update. He kept his eyes fixed on the double doors leading to the emergency room, hoping with every fiber of his being that the next person to come out would have good news. The minutes felt like hours, and the air was heavy with the kind of silence that made everything worse. Nurses passed by in quick motions, their footsteps echoing in the otherwise quiet hallway, but none of them spared a glance at the boy sitting so still, lost in thought. Ethan couldn't stop replaying the moment he had found the baby in his mind. The faint, heartbreaking cry cutting through the alley, the pile of garbage, the tiny form wrapped in a filthy, torn blanket. His stomach twisted at the thought. The baby had been so small, so fragile, and yet whoever had left it there hadn't thought twice. Who could do something like that? He wondered for what felt like the 100th time. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the image from his mind. He didn't know how long he had been sitting there when a figure finally appeared in his peripheral vision. His heart leapt, hoping it was someone coming to tell him that the baby was okay, but it was just Dr. Harper again. The man looked more tired than the last time Ethan had seen him. Dark circles under his eyes and a weary expression etched onto his face. He approached Ethan slowly, his steps cautious as if he were preparing for a difficult conversation. "Ethan," Dr. Harper said softly, his voice a little hoarse. "We need to talk for a moment." Ethan's heart sank. The tone in the doctor's voice wasn't one that carried good news. He had heard that tone before, when the doctor had explained that his mother wasn't coming home from the hospital after her long illness. That same sense of dread crawled up his spine now, settling in his chest. Without saying a word, Ethan stood up, his legs shaking slightly as he followed Dr. Harper down the hall. The doctor led him to a small consultation room, a sterile, impersonal space with pale blue walls and uncomfortable chairs. There was a large window that overlooked the hospital parking lot, the view showing nothing but rows of cars and a gray, overcast sky. The room was eerily quiet except for the faint hum of machinery in the distance. Ethan sat down stiffly, barely aware of his movements, his mind spinning with the possibilities of what Dr. Harper was about to say. The doctor took a seat across from him, exhaling slowly before beginning. "The baby is stable for now," he started, his eyes flicking over to Ethan as if gauging his reaction. "But the situation is still very serious. The infant was severely malnourished and dehydrated when you brought it in. It's going to take time for the baby's body to recover from that kind of neglect." Ethan swallowed hard, the knot in his throat making it difficult to speak. "So, the baby's going to be okay?" Dr. Harper paused, his brow furrowing slightly. "We're hopeful," he said carefully, his voice tinged with caution. "But it's still too early to tell for sure. The baby's condition was critical when you found it, and there are still complications we're keeping an eye on." "What kind of complications?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The doctor leaned forward, his tone growing more serious. "There are signs of physical trauma," he explained. "The baby has bruising on its arms and legs, and there's an older fracture, probably a broken rib that was never treated. These injuries suggest that the baby wasn't just neglected, but possibly harmed in other ways before it was abandoned." Ethan's blood ran cold at the words. The thought of someone intentionally hurting a baby made his stomach turn, a deep, sickening anger bubbling up inside him. How could anyone do that to something so helpless, so innocent? His fists clenched on his lap, his nails digging into his palms as he tried to process the information. He had thought finding the baby in the trash was bad enough, but now, knowing that the infant had been hurt beforehand, it was almost too much to bear. Dr. Harper must have seen the emotion on Ethan's face, because he softened his tone, leaning forward slightly. "Ethan, I know this is a lot to take in," he said gently, "but I want you to know that you did everything right. You saved that baby's life by getting it here when you did. Without your quick thinking, the baby wouldn't have survived." Ethan nodded slowly, though the words barely registered. All he could think about was the baby's bruised body, the tiny ribs that had been broken and left untreated. The guilt washed over him in waves. He had found the baby, yes, but that didn't change the fact that someone had left it there to die. The idea that there was a person out there, someone who had hurt the baby and then abandoned it without a second thought, made Ethan feel sick. "What happens now?" he asked after a long moment, his voice small and uncertain. "What happens to the baby?" Dr. Harper leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest as he considered his response. "Well, the first priority is getting the baby healthy again. That could take a few days or even weeks, depending on how it responds to treatment. But once the baby is stable, social services will take over. They'll investigate the circumstances of the abandonment, and they'll be working with the police to try and find out who left the baby in the alley." "The police?" Ethan repeated, feeling a sudden jolt of nerves. "They're going to arrest someone." Dr. Harper hesitated, his expression growing more thoughtful. "That depends on what they find. If they can locate the mother or whoever was responsible for the baby's care, there will definitely be legal consequences. But it's not always as simple as arresting someone. Sometimes people do terrible things out of desperation. We don't know what the circumstances are yet." Ethan's stomach twisted again. Desperation, that word stuck with him. He had been thinking all along that whoever left the baby in the trash must have been cruel, heartless. But now, hearing Dr. Harper talk about it, he wondered if there was more to the story. Could someone have abandoned their child out of fear or desperation? Was it possible that they had been pushed to the edge, unable to care for the baby and not knowing where to turn? It didn't make sense to him, even if they had been desperate. How could anyone justify leaving a baby to die like that? But as much as he wanted to be angry, there was a part of him that couldn't shake the feeling that maybe there was more to it. Maybe whoever had done this was just as lost and scared as the baby had been. What if they don't find the mother? Ethan asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. If they don't find the mother, or if she's deemed unfit to care for the child, then the baby will go into the foster care system, Dr. Harper explained. Eventually, if the baby's biological family can't be located or if they aren't suitable guardians, the child could be put up for adoption. Adoption. The word hung in the air like a promise and a threat all at once. Ethan had known kids at school who were adopted, and for some of them it had worked out okay. They had families who loved them, who gave them homes. But for others, it hadn't gone so well. He thought of his friend Jake, whose foster parents had been cold and distant, more interested in the government checks than in Jake himself. Ethan's mind raced with questions he didn't know how to ask. What would happen to the baby after this? Would it be bounced around from home to home, never really finding a place where it belonged, or would it end up with a family who actually cared? The uncertainty of it all made his chest ache. Will I ever see the baby again? Ethan asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Dr. Harper seemed surprised by the question. That depends on what happens next, he said carefully. Once social services takes over, they'll be in charge of the baby's welfare. It's possible that you could stay updated on the baby's condition, but once the legal process starts, it's largely out of our hands. Ethan nodded slowly, though his heart sank at the thought. He had found the baby, brought it to the hospital, but now it felt like everything was slipping away. It felt wrong somehow to just walk away from it all now. He had been there at the start. Didn't that mean something? Didn't that give him some sort of responsibility? But he wasn't family. He wasn't an adult. And he wasn't a part of the legal system that was now taking over. The feeling of helplessness gnawed at him, tightening in his chest. Before Ethan could ask anything else, there was a knock on the door. A tall man with dark hair and a serious expression stepped into the room, his presence filling the space. He wore a dark suit and a badge clipped to his belt. Ethan immediately knew this was the detective Dr. Harper had mentioned earlier. Ethan, I'm Detective Harper, the man said, his voice calm but firm. He held a notepad in one hand, flipping it open as he sat down across from the boy. I need to ask you a few questions about what happened today. It won't take long, but we need as much information as possible. Ethan nodded, his heart racing again. He had known this was coming. The police had to be involved, but now that it was happening, it felt more real. His hands fidgeted in his lap, and he struggled to keep his breathing steady. The detective gave him a reassuring look. You're not in trouble, Ethan. You did a really good thing today, but we need to understand what happened so we can help the baby and figure out who's responsible. Ethan nodded again, though his throat felt tight. Let's start from the beginning, Detective Harper said, his pen poised over the notepad. Tell me everything you remember. How did you find the baby? Ethan took a deep breath, his mind racing back to that moment in the alley. He described everything as best he could. The shortcut he always took to school, the strange silence that had made him stop, the faint cry that had led him to the trash pile. He told the detective how he had been too scared at first to check, how he had hesitated, unsure if he even wanted to see what was making that sound. But then when he couldn't ignore it anymore, he had uncovered the baby, lying there so still and cold. As he spoke, he could feel the tension in the room building, the weight of what he had witnessed hanging over him like a shadow. The detective listened carefully, jotting down notes but not interrupting. When Ethan finished, he sat back, his hands still shaking slightly. Did you see anyone near the alley when you found the baby? Detective Harper asked, his tone more intense now. Any cars or people who might have been acting suspiciously? Ethan shook his head. No, it was really quiet. I didn't see anyone. The detective's expression didn't change, but he scribbled something in his notebook before closing it. All right, thank you, Ethan. That helps a lot. We'll be investigating the area, checking for security cameras or any witnesses who might have seen something. Ethan swallowed hard. The thought of someone out there, someone who had left the baby to die, made his skin crawl. And now, knowing that the baby had been hurt before it was abandoned, it was all too much. He wanted to ask what would happen next, if they would catch the person responsible, but the words stuck in his throat. Detective Harper stood up, giving Ethan a small nod before heading for the door. You've done everything you can, he said as he left. We'll take it from here. And then, just like that, he was gone, leaving Ethan alone with Dr. Harper once more. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ethan sat there, staring at the floor, his mind spinning with everything he had just heard. The baby was stable, but still at risk. The police were looking for the mother, or whoever had left the child in the alley, and somewhere in all of this, Ethan felt like he was losing his grip on everything. He had found the baby. He had been the one to bring it to the hospital, but now it felt like things were slipping away from him, like his role in this was over, even though it didn't feel like it should be. Dr. Harper stood up slowly, his face softening as he looked at Ethan. "I know this is a lot to process," he said gently. "If you need to talk to anyone, we have counselors here who can help. You've been through a very traumatic experience today, and it's okay to feel overwhelmed." Ethan shook his head. "I'm fine," he mumbled, though he wasn't sure if that was true. He didn't know what he felt. His chest ached, and his mind was a whirl of thoughts and questions that he couldn't sort through. All he knew was that he couldn't walk away now. Not yet. Not when everything felt so unfinished. Dr. Harper gave him a long, thoughtful look before finally speaking again. "If you ever want an update on the baby's condition, you can call the hospital. We'll keep you informed as much as we can, all right?" Ethan nodded, though his heart sank. He wanted to do more than just get updates. He wanted to be there to see the baby get better, to know for sure that it was safe. But he knew that wasn't possible. He wasn't family. He was just the kid who had found the baby, that's all. As Dr. Harper left the room, Ethan sat there alone, staring out the window at the darkening sky. The world outside felt distant, detached from everything that had happened today. It was as if the rest of the world had kept spinning while his life had been thrown into chaos. He felt small, powerless, and more alone than ever. For the first time since finding the baby, Ethan let himself cry. Ethan stood outside the hospital, the cold air biting at his skin as he zipped up his coat and shoved his hands deep into his pockets. The weight of everything that had happened in the last 24 hours hung heavy on his shoulders. He hadn't slept, he hadn't been able to. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the baby's tiny body lying in the trash, so fragile, so helpless. The hospital staff had told him to go home, to rest, but how could he? It felt wrong to just walk away, to leave the baby in someone else's hands and pretend everything was normal. But after hours of waiting, of sitting in that sterile, suffocating room, he had no choice. They couldn't give him any more updates. The baby was still in critical condition, and all they could do now was wait. Social services had already been notified, and the investigation had started. Soon, the police would be involved. It was out of his hands now, even though it didn't feel like it should be. As he walked down the empty street, his breath visible in the chilly October air, Ethan's thoughts spiraled. What was going to happen to the baby? Would they find the mother? Would she be arrested? He couldn't shake the image of the bruises, the broken rib, things that had happened before the baby had been abandoned. The idea that someone had hurt the baby made his stomach churn with anger. But the more he thought about it, the more confused he became. Who would do something like that, and why? He had tried asking Dr. Harper more questions, but the doctor hadn't had many answers. Everything was still too uncertain, too early. The investigation would take time, and even then, Ethan wasn't sure if he would ever get the closure he needed. He wasn't family, he wasn't part of the system. He was just a kid who had found the baby, who had done the right thing, but was it enough? The following morning, Ethan woke up with the same uneasy feeling in his chest. He hadn't been able to stay asleep for long. His dreams filled with haunting images of the alley and the baby's cries. He got dressed quickly, his mind already set on going back to the hospital. He needed to know if there was any change. He couldn't just sit at home and do nothing. His dad, noticing his restlessness at breakfast, looked at him with concern. "You okay, Ethan?" he asked, setting down his coffee cup. "You barely ate last night, and now you're rushing off again." Ethan hesitated, unsure of how to explain the weight he was carrying. I need to check on something," he muttered, pushing his cereal around in the bowl. He hadn't told his dad everything yet. The words felt too heavy, too complicated. How could he explain the overwhelming need he felt to see this through? To know that the baby was going to be okay? "Something at school," his dad pressed, frowning slightly. "You've been distracted since yesterday." Ethan shook his head. "Not school, He stopped, swallowing hard. "There's this baby. I found it yesterday in the alley behind the shops. Someone left it there, Dad. It was really bad and I had to take it to the hospital." His dad's face paled, the casual concern shifting into something more serious. "A baby," he repeated, his voice low. "Ethan, why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't know how," Ethan admitted, his voice shaking. "It all happened so fast, and I don't know what's going to happen to it now. I just feel like I can't walk away." His dad leaned back in his chair, processing what Ethan had just told him. After a long pause, and he spoke again, his tone more gentle this time. "Ethan, that's a lot for anyone to go through, let alone you. But you did the right thing by getting that baby to the hospital. I'm proud of you." Ethan nodded, but the words didn't bring him the comfort he wanted. He appreciated his dad's support, but it wasn't enough to quiet the worry that gnawed at him. "I just want to check on the baby," he said quietly. "I need to know if it's okay." His dad sighed softly, standing up and placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I get it, kid. If you want, I can drive you to the hospital." Ethan looked up at his dad, surprised by the offer. "Really?" "Yeah," his dad said, offering a small smile. "Let's go. You've got a big heart, Ethan. I don't want you carrying this on your own." The drive to the hospital was quiet, the streets still damp from the early morning mist. Ethan stared out the window, his mind still racing with thoughts about the baby. His dad hadn't said much after their conversation at breakfast, but his presence was reassuring in a way. It made Ethan feel less alone, like someone else understood how important this was. When they arrived at the hospital, Ethan's heart raced as he walked through the familiar automatic doors. He half expected the same nurse from the day before to be there, but the front desk had a new face, a younger nurse who smiled politely as Ethan and his dad approached. "Hi," Ethan said nervously. I'm here to check on a baby. I brought it in yesterday." The nurse's expression softened as she glanced at the computer in front of her. "You mean the baby that was abandoned?" Ethan nodded, his chest tightening at the word abandoned. "Yeah, that one." The nurse typed something into the system before nodding. "The baby's stable for now. The doctors are still monitoring closely, but it's a positive sign that the condition hasn't worsened overnight." A wave of relief washed over Ethan. Stable. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was better than the uncertainty he had felt all night. "Can I see it?" The nurse hesitated, her smile faltering. "I'm afraid you can't visit the baby directly. It's still in the intensive care unit, and only medical staff and social services are allowed in at this stage. But I can get Dr. Harper to give you an update if you'd like." Ethan's heart sank a little, but he nodded. "Okay, that would be great. Thanks." As the nurse walked away to find the doctor, Ethan sat down in the waiting area with his dad, trying to calm the mix of emotions swirling inside him. The knowledge that the baby was stable brought some comfort, but it didn't solve the bigger questions weighing on his mind. What would happen next? Would the baby get better? Would they find the person responsible? And what about the baby's future? Where would it go? His dad, sensing his unease, gave him a gentle nudge. "You're doing good, Ethan. I know it's hard not to feel like you're in control, but you've done more than most people would." "I just don't know what's going to happen to the baby," Ethan said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if it never gets adopted? What if it gets lost in the system?" His dad's face softened with understanding. "That's a tough question, and I wish I had an answer for you. But I do know that because of you, that baby has a chance, and that's something no one can take away." Before Ethan could respond, Dr. Harper appeared, walking toward them with a kind but tired smile. "Ethan he greeted. "I heard you were here. I'm glad you came back." Ethan stood up quickly, anxious for an update. "Is the baby still okay?" Dr. Harper nodded. "Yes, the baby's stable, which is a good sign. We're still monitoring closely, but things are moving in the right direction. The baby's vitals have improved overnight, and we're working on getting it stronger with fluids and proper nutrition." Ethan's shoulders sagged with relief, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That's great news." Dr. Harper's expression remained serious, though. "There's still a long road ahead. The baby's condition was critical when you brought it in, so we're taking it one step at a time. But you should be proud of what you did. You saved that child's life." Ethan nodded, but the doctor's praise, while appreciated, wasn't enough to ease the tension in his chest. There was still so much uncertainty, so much that could go wrong. And then there was the looming question that had been gnawing at him since the night before. What would happen to the baby next? As if reading his thoughts, Dr. Harper sighed softly before continuing. Social services is involved now. They'll be handling the baby's case from here on out. The police are still investigating, trying to track down whoever left the baby in the alley, but that could take time. Ethan's stomach twisted at the thought. What happens if they don't find the person who did it? What happens to the baby then? Dr. Harper exchanged a look with Ethan's dad before answering. If the biological family can't be found, or if they're deemed unfit, the baby will likely go into foster care. It's too soon to say what the long-term outcome will be, but the important thing is that the baby will be in a safe environment, whether that's through foster care or adoption. Ethan's heart sank at the word foster care. He knew what that could mean. A life of being bounced from home to home, never really belonging anywhere. He had seen it with his friend Jake, who had been in and out of foster homes for years before being adopted by a family that didn't really care about him. The thought of that happening to the baby made his chest ache. Is there anything I can do? Ethan asked, his voice barely audible. Dr. Harper gave him a sad smile. You've already done so much, Ethan. Right now, the best thing you can do is trust the system to take care of the baby. I know it's hard, but you've given that child a chance at life. That's no small thing. Ethan wanted to argue, to say that it wasn't enough, but he didn't have the words. Instead, he nodded quietly, trying to process everything the doctor had said. His dad placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently. Come on, his dad said softly. Let's get you home. We can come back tomorrow if you want to check in again. Ethan hesitated, his eyes lingering on the hallway that led to the ICU. He wanted to stay, to be close to the baby, but he knew there was nothing more he could do right now. With a heavy heart, he followed his dad out of the hospital, the weight of everything pressing down on him as they walked to the car. The next few days were a blur of school, restless nights, and constant worry. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the baby, wondering if it was getting stronger, if the doctors had found any new complications. Every morning before school and every afternoon after, he and his dad would stop by the hospital for an update. Each time, the news was cautiously optimistic, stable, improving, but still critical. It wasn't the reassurance Ethan wanted, but it was enough to keep him going. On the fourth day, when Ethan and his dad arrived at the hospital, Dr. Harper had news that sent Ethan's heart racing. The baby's been moved out of intensive care, Dr. Harper said with a smile. We're not out of the woods yet, but this is a very positive step. Ethan felt a surge of relief. Can I see the baby now? Dr. Harper hesitated for a moment before nodding. I can arrange for a brief visit, but only for a few minutes. Social services has been very strict about limiting visitors, but given your role in saving the baby, I'll make an exception. Ethan's heart pounded as he followed Dr. Harper down the hallway. His dad waited in the lobby, understanding Ethan's need to do this alone. As they reached the nursery, Ethan's pulse quickened. He had imagined this moment for days, seeing the baby, knowing it was okay. But now that it was about to happen, a part of him was terrified. What if the baby didn't recognize him? What if it didn't matter that he had been the one to save it? Dr. Harper led Ethan to a small room, where the baby lay in a bassinet, wrapped in a clean, soft blanket. The sight of the baby, so much healthier than the last time Ethan had seen it, brought tears to his eyes. The baby's skin was no longer pale and fragile looking. It was still small, still vulnerable, but there was life in the way its tiny chest rose and fell steadily. Hey, Ethan whispered, stepping closer to the bassinet. He reached out, his hand hovering above the baby's tiny fingers, unsure if he should touch them. It's me. The baby stirred slightly, a soft coo escaping its lips, and Ethan's heart swelled. He didn't know how long he stood there, just watching. But in that moment, everything else, the investigation, the uncertainty, the fear, faded away. For the first time in days, Ethan felt hope. Ethan's visits to the hospital became less frequent after that. The baby continued to improve, and social services became more involved, slowly taking control of the situation. It was bittersweet for Ethan, knowing that the baby's future was now in the hands of a system he had no control over. But Dr. Harper had promised to keep him updated, and that gave him some comfort. Weeks passed, and soon the baby was discharged from the hospital, placed into the custody of social services. Ethan never got to know the baby's fate, whether it was adopted, placed in foster care, or reunited with family, but he carried the memory of those days with him, a reminder of the connection he had shared with the child. However brief, in the end, Ethan understood that saving the baby had changed him in ways he couldn't have imagined. It had made him realize the importance of compassion, of stepping up when no one else would. And while he didn't have all the answers, he knew one thing for certain: he had made a difference. And that was enough. The sun was setting over Ashbury, casting a golden light over the streets as Ethan walked home from school. It had been a month since the baby had left the hospital, and though life had slowly returned to normal, a part of him still felt unsettled. He often found his thoughts drifting back to the baby, wondering where it was now, whether it was in a foster home or with a new family. No one had given him any updates since the baby was discharged, and while Dr. Harper had done his best to keep him informed, it was clear that once social services took over, the process became a private matter. Ethan had come to terms with that as much as he could, but the uncertainty lingered. He had become attached to the baby in a way he hadn't expected, and the idea of not knowing what had happened felt like an open wound that hadn't quite healed. His dad had tried to reassure him, telling him that the baby was safe now, that he had done everything he could, but Ethan wasn't sure if that was enough. As he turned the corner onto his street, he saw a familiar figure sitting on the front steps of his house. His heart skipped a beat when he recognized Dr. Harper, still in his white coat, though it looked a little more rumpled than usual. The doctor stood as Ethan approached, a smile on his face that was both warm and tired. "Dr. Harper?" Ethan asked, surprised to see him outside of the hospital. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to give you some news," Dr. Harper said, stepping down from the porch. "I figured you deserved to hear it in person." Ethan's heart began to race, a mixture of hope and fear bubbling up inside him. "Is it about the baby?" Dr. Harper nodded. "Yes. I know it's been a long time since we last talked, and I wanted to give you an update. The investigation is still ongoing, but the baby's been placed with a foster family for now. It's a temporary placement, but the good news is that the baby's doing very well. The foster parents are loving and attentive, and social services is optimistic about finding a permanent home soon." A wave of relief washed over Ethan. The idea of the baby being in a loving home, even temporarily, eased some of the weight that had been pressing on him for weeks. That's great," Ethan said, his voice catching slightly. "I'm glad," Dr. Harper smiled gently. "I thought you'd like to know. You've been through a lot these past few weeks, and I know how much you've cared about the baby. You made a difference, Ethan, more than you realize." Ethan looked down at his feet, feeling a mixture of pride and sadness. I just want to know that the baby's going to be okay. That it'll have a good life, you know." Dr. Harper nodded, his expression understanding. "I think it will. The baby has a real chance now, thanks to you. But I also wanted to tell you something else." Ethan looked up, his brow furrowed. "What is it?" "The foster family has asked if you'd like to stay involved," Dr. Harper said, his tone careful. "They know about what you did, and they're open to the idea of you visiting the baby if that's something you want." Ethan blinked, the words taking a moment to sink in. "I can visit, really?" Dr. Harper smiled. "Yes, really. It would be a way for you to stay connected, to be a part of the baby's life, even if it's just in small ways." For a moment, Ethan was too stunned to respond. He had thought that once the baby was placed with a family, his involvement would be over. He had prepared himself for that reality, even if it hurt. But now, hearing that he could still be a part of the baby's life, something inside him shifted, a sense of hope, of possibility, that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in weeks. "I'd love that," Ethan finally said, his voice filled with emotion. "I'd really love that." Dr. Harper nodded, his smile growing wider. "I thought you might. I'll give the foster family your information, and they can set up a time for you to visit. It might take a little while, but I'm sure it'll happen soon." Ethan felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since the day he found the baby. "Thank you, Dr. Harper," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for everything." The doctor placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You don't have to thank me, Ethan. You're the one who saved that baby's life. I just did my job." As Dr. Harper turned to leave, Ethan stood on the porch watching him walk down the street. The weight that had been pressing on him for weeks had finally lifted, replaced by a sense of peace he hadn't expected to find. The baby was safe, and though the future was still uncertain, Ethan knew that he had done everything he could. And now, he had the chance to be a part of the baby's life in a way he hadn't thought possible. The first visit came a few weeks later. Ethan had been anxious the entire day, his mind racing with thoughts about what it would be like to see the baby again. The foster family, the Whitmans, lived just outside of Ashbury in a small, cozy house with a big garden. When Ethan and his dad pulled up to the house, he could see a swing set in the yard, and the sight of it made his heart swell. This was a place where a child could be happy, where a child could grow up safe and loved. Mrs. Whitman, a kind woman in her 40s with warm brown eyes, greeted them at the door. She welcomed Ethan in with a smile, her presence calming his nerves. "We're so happy you're here, Ethan," she said, leading him into the living room. "The baby's just waking up from a nap. You'll get to see him in a minute." Him. Ethan felt a jolt of surprise at the pronoun. He hadn't known whether the baby was a boy or a girl, and hearing it now, it made everything feel more real. Him. The baby was a boy. Mrs. Whitman disappeared into the next room, and a few moments later she returned with the baby in her arms. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he saw the little boy, so much healthier and stronger than the last time he had seen him. The bruises were gone, replaced by rosy cheeks, and his small body was wrapped in a soft blue onesie. The baby's eyes, bright and curious, blinked up at Ethan as Mrs. Whitman placed him in a bouncy chair on the floor. "Here he is," Mrs. Whitman said softly. "His name is James, but you can call him Jamie if you'd like." Ethan knelt down next to the chair, his heart swelling with emotion as he looked at the baby. Jamie. He reached out slowly, his fingers brushing against Jamie's tiny hand. The baby cooed softly, his eyes following Ethan's movements with fascination. "Hi, Jamie," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's me. I'm the one who found you." Jamie blinked up at him, his little fingers curling around Ethan's in a soft, gentle grip. It was such a small thing, but to Ethan it felt like the world. In the weeks and months that followed, Ethan visited Jamie often. The Whitmans welcomed him with open arms, allowing him to be a part of Jamie's life in a way that made him feel like he belonged. As Jamie grew stronger, Ethan found himself growing too, learning the importance of kindness, of compassion, of stepping up when no one else would. The future was still uncertain. Ethan knew that Jamie's situation could change at any time. Social services could find a permanent family, or the legal process could take a different turn. But for now, Jamie was safe, happy, and loved. And for Ethan, that was enough. As he stood in the Whitmans' garden one sunny afternoon, watching Jamie play on the grass, Ethan felt a deep sense of peace. The journey that had started in an alley, with fear and uncertainty, had led him here, to a place where hope was possible, where love was stronger than the darkness that had once threatened to swallow Jamie's life. Ethan smiled, knowing that whatever happened next, he had made a difference. He had saved Jamie's life. And in doing so, he had found something precious too, a sense of purpose, of connection that would stay with him forever. Because sometimes, in the most unexpected ways, life gives you a second chance, and Ethan had taken it.